They said the forest held nothing but shadows, just cedar trees' silence, and the ghosts of old legends. But when a broke cowboy followed his black stallion into those woods, he found more than hoof prints in the soil. The horse stopped at one spot, pawed at the earth, and revealed the first glint of metal. What they unearthed beneath the roots wasn't just a chest. It was a fortune worth millions, and a secret men would kill to possess. From that moment, the cowboy's fight for survival turned into a battle for his very soul. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning at Dry Creek broke quietly, as it always did, with a thin veil of dust hanging over the land, like a reminder of how barren it had become. The creek itself was little more than a shallow ribbon of water, now its banks cracked and dry, where once it had run steady and strong. Sparse patches of grass struggled against the sun, their blades brittle and pale, swaying only when the wind passed through, carrying the taste of dust. That same wind tugged at the sagging roof of a cabin that leaned wearily at the edge of the clearing. The place looked as though it had been standing on stubbornness alone. Shingles missing rafters warped by too many storms, walls split and patched with whatever scrap wood Elias Carter could find. From the crooked chimney, a thread of smoke rose thin and hesitant, carrying the smell of damp pine and cheap coffee. Inside the cabin, Elias moved slowly, his boots creaking on the warped floorboards. He was a man in his mid-30s, though the hard years carved deeper lines into his face than his age deserved. His frame was lean, almost wiry, his shoulders stooped from labor that had given little in return. A faded shirt clung to him, threadbare at the elbows, and his hands, scarred and calloused, looked older than the rest of him. The ranch had given up most of its life months ago. The cattle were gone, the chickens sold off. Even the mule that had once dragged the plow was nothing but a memory. Now there was only him and the hollow cabin, and the one creature that hadn't abandoned him, the black horse tethered outside. Midnight. The animal was tall and powerful, his coat a deep polished black that caught what little sunlight managed to filter through the haze. His mane hung long, a dark river that framed sharp, intelligent eyes. Elias had bought him years back at a livestock auction, where the price had been low because the horse had bitten 2 handlers in a single afternoon. No one else wanted him. But Elias had seen something behind the animal's defiance, a spark that matched the one flickering stubbornly inside himself. Since then, they had lived side by side. Elias spoke to Midnight as though he were a brother rather than a beast, talking to him while fixing fences or nursing the last pot of beans on the stove. Midnight never answered, of course, but sometimes he would tilt his head or blow a heavy breath from his nostrils at just the right moment, as though he understood. That was enough to keep Elias sane during long nights when silence pressed too heavily against the cabin walls. Each morning began the same way. Elias would pour himself a tin cup of coffee so thin it looked like muddy water, step out onto the porch, and find Midnight waiting there. The horse would stand close to the steps, ears twitching, drawing in the smoke as though savoring it. The ritual was comforting grounding. It told Elias that no matter how poor the ranch had become, he wasn't entirely alone. But lately Midnight had changed. The first time Elias noticed it was subtle. He opened the cabin door and found the horse tugging lightly at his tether neck, stretched toward the tree line of Cedar Hollow. When Elias finally gave in and loosened the rope, Midnight trotted purposefully toward the woods, pausing only to glance back as though asking, "Are you coming?" Elias followed out of curiosity. He assumed the horse had scented fresher grass or water. But when they reached the edge of the hollow, Midnight stopped, pawed at the ground once, and then seemed content to linger there. Nothing unusual, Elias thought, and led him back. The next day, it happened again, and the day after that. Each morning, the same determined pull toward the hollow, with the same insistence on reaching a particular clearing beneath the shadow of the tall cedar trees. Elias began to feel a faint irritation. Midnight had never been a difficult horse, restless at times, proud and spirited, yes, but never this persistent. The behavior was so unlike him that Elias found himself torn between annoyance and unease. "Damn fool," Elias muttered on the third morning, yanking lightly at the reins. Midnight resisted hoof-striking against the dirt in protest. What troubled Elias most was the precision. Midnight wasn't wandering. He wasn't foraging. He was leading. Every time he stopped in the same spot, as if something buried there tugged at him. Cedar Hollow itself was not a place Elias cared for. The trees there grew thick and closed their canopies, knitting overhead to choke out sunlight. Moss clung stubbornly to every trunk, and the air felt heavy damp, as though the forest never quite let go of the night. Ravens nested high in the branches, their cries breaking the silence like warnings. That morning, Elias gave up on fighting. He let Midnight walk freely, reins loose, and trailed behind. The horse's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as though following an invisible scent. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the forest became. The crunch of old leaves under Elias's boots was the only answer to the wind sighing through the cedars. At last, Midnight stopped in a small clearing. Shafts of weak light pierced through the canopy, painting the mossy ground in uneven patches of gold. The horse lowered his head, then struck the earth with his hoof. Once, twice, a third time. Each blow sent dirt scattering until finally there came a dull, resonant clunk. Elias frowned, his breath catching. What in God's name? Midnight pawed again, more insistent this time. Dust rose, mingling with the smell of damp soil. Elias crouched, ran his fingers across the disturbed ground. To his eyes, it looked no different from the rest of the forest floor. Yet the horse continued ears-back movements, sharp with urgency. Elias leaned back on his heels, unsettled. Horses, he knew, had senses sharper than men. They could smell water beneath the earth, sense predators long before they appeared. He'd heard stories of mustangs refusing to cross ground that later gave way into sinkholes. But this was different. Midnight wasn't avoiding danger. He was pointing at something, almost pleading. The thought slid into Elias's mind. Uninvited, maybe he's trying to tell me something. The sun was already sliding low by the time Elias Carter trudged back toward his cabin. His boots were heavy with dirt from Cedar Hollow, his mind heavier still with questions he had no answer for. Midnight walked beside him, ears flicking nervously, as if still listening for unseen dangers in the trees. Elias tried to push away the strange memory of the horse pawing the earth and the hollow clang that had risen from beneath the soil. There was enough to worry about without adding mysteries to the list. When he reached the cabin, the evening light painted the rough-hewn boards in a tired, amber glow. On the table inside, lying squarely in the middle as though it had been waiting for him all along, was an envelope stamped with the official seal of Dry Creek County. Elias froze. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Still, he tore it open with trembling fingers. The words were merciless final notice. 10 days to pay all outstanding debts in full, or the Carter Ranch would be seized and sold at public auction. 10 days. No extensions, no appeals. The ink was fresh, the signature hurried, the stamp pressed deeper than usual into the paper signs of a process rushed, pushed. Elias's jaw tightened. This wasn't the impartial hand of county business. This was Silas Boone's shadow, pressing down on the paper with all the weight of his wealth and influence. Elias read the notice again, and then again, until the letters blurred together. It felt less like words, more like a sentence already carried out. He sat heavily at the table, the notice limp in his hands, his chest heavy with the weight of inevitability. 10 days. He might as well have been given 10 hours. Outside, the ranch lay in silence that felt like mockery. The old cattle pens stood empty, their gates sagging, ropes frayed and swinging in the wind. A trough lay overturned, cracked dry at the bottom. Beyond it stretched the pasture once full of movement and sound, now a brittle expanse of sunburnt grass, split by spiderweb cracks in the soil. The barn leaned like a drunk against the horizon, half its roof collapsed doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. When rain came, it poured straight through, soaking the dirt floor until it stank of rot. The cabin itself, patched again and again with scavenged boards, bore the scars of too many storms. One window had been nailed shut with mismatched planks, the other covered with a ragged piece of cloth. Once the place had been alive with noise, the bawl of calves, the clatter of buckets, the steady rhythm of hooves in the corral. Elias could almost hear echoes of it now if he stood still long enough. But the echoes were all that remained. The cattle had been sold off months ago, each sale a nail in the coffin of his pride. The chickens had gone next, their squawks fading into silence that still haunted him at night. Only midnight remained a black figure against the dying fields, grazing on what little grass could be coaxed from the stubborn ground. Elias's chest tightened at the sight. A man and his horse, that was all that was left of the Carter ranch. Inside, Elias pulled a small wooden box from beneath his bed. It was the last repository of his dwindling fortune. He set it on the table, lifted the lid, and poured the contents into his palm. A few coins clinked together, pitiful in their smallness. He counted them once, then twice, hoping numbers would change by will alone. They did not. $18. Not enough to cover a week's groceries, let alone a mountain of debt. He laid the coins back in the box and stared at the pile of papers stacked in the corner. Bills upon bills, interest payments, overdue taxes, service fees he barely understood. Each bore the same cruel mark in red ink: final notice. He had stopped opening them weeks ago, unable to face the arithmetic of failure. Elias rubbed his temples. Numbers didn't lie. They were clean, efficient killers. They stripped away excuses and sentiment, leaving nothing but the brutal truth: he was broke, and there was no salvation to be found in ledgers. He didn't need to look far to know whose hand guided this downfall. Silas Boone. The Boone Ranch stretched for miles just north of Dry Creek Fat, with cattle shining with new corrals and barns built by hired hands who worked day and night. Silas himself was a man wrapped in fine leather and arrogance. His name carried more weight than most court orders. He was known to buy land for pennies on the dollar, always conveniently after its owners had fallen into debt. And if they hadn't fallen yet, Boone was more than willing to give them a push. Elias pictured Boone riding past his fields, smug atop a glossy bay horse, surveying the Carter ranch like a predator circling a weakened calf. It was no coincidence that the county clerk's office had suddenly reassessed his land. No coincidence that his notices now carried final warnings with impossible deadlines. Boone's hand was in it, Elias was sure. The contrast between them was a wound Elias could not ignore. Boone's ranch bustled with activity men, mending fences, cattle lowing horses, galloping in well-kept corrals. The Carter place, by comparison, was a ghost, one man and one horse rattling around the bones of what once had been a proud homestead. That night, Elias sat in the dim cabin with the lamp flickering, staring at the notice, until the flame burned it into his vision. His gaze drifted to the wall, where an old photograph hung, edges curling with age. His father's face looked back at him hard and weathered, the man who had built this land with his own 2 hands. His mother's eyes shone beside him, gentle yet proud. Their voices rose in memory echoes of lessons carved into his bones. Land is blood, son. Lose the land, you lose everything. Elias closed his eyes, but the memories came anyway. His father showing him how to hitch a plow, how to walk the rows steady and sure. His mother spreading wheat to dry on sheets by the porch, her hands flour-dusted, her laugh carrying on the breeze. Those were days when the ranch had been alive, when the land had still given more than it took. Now all of it hung in the balance, and Elias, their only son, had failed to hold it. Shame cut deeper than hunger. It pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. He imagined what his father would say, what his mother's eyes would look like if they could see him now, broken, cornered, unable to defend the ground they had bled for. He set the notice down, his hand trembling. The words swam on the page. 10 days. The morning came with mist. Elias had barely closed his eyes all night, and the words "final notice" burned into the back of his eyelids. When the pale light of dawn crept across the cabin floor, he rose stiffly from his cot, his mind clouded with fatigue. Outside, the world lay hushed beneath a shroud of thin fog. The ranch looked ghostly in the gray light. The fence posts sagged like weary sentinels, the gate clung to its hinges by rust alone. The cabin stood silent, not even the whistle of wind through the cracks could break the stillness. And at the edge of it all, waiting at the front gate, was midnight. The horse shifted from hoof to hoof, striking the dirt with a steady rhythm. His breath steamed in the cool air, nostrils flaring. His dark shape was half swallowed by fog, but his intent was unmistakable. He wanted to go back. Elias rubbed his tired eyes. Not again, he muttered, though he already knew resistance was useless. Midnight had the same look in his eyes he'd had for days now, a look that demanded more than obedience. It demanded trust. With a sigh, Elias pulled on his threadbare coat and tugged his hat low against the damp air. "Fine," he said quietly, tightening the strap of his boots. "Lead on, boy. Maybe walking will do me more good than sitting in this tomb of a cabin." The trail into Cedar Hollow was slick with dew, the earth soft underfoot. Each step sank slightly into the dark soil, leaving prints that glistened with moisture. Dead leaves carpeted the ground, their edges curling, their colors dulled to shades of brown and gray. Overhead, the cedars locked their branches like a ceiling, filtering the light into narrow shafts that fell across the path like pale beams. The forest carried its own hush, broken only by the occasional caw of a raven, echoing somewhere far off. Midnight's hooves struck the ground with slow, deliberate rhythm, each thud echoing deeper than it should have in the silence. Elias trailed with his hand resting loosely on the reins, but he did not guide the horse. Midnight needed no guidance. His body was taut, focused, as if he were following something unseen. Elias tried to swallow the unease rising in his throat. His eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, his ears tuned to every rustle. "It's just a horse leading me to grass," he told himself, though the lie didn't land with conviction. What lay in Cedar Hollow was not comfort, not food. It was something else, something that pulled at midnight so insistently it felt almost alive. The deeper they went, the heavier the air grew. The mist lingered in low pockets, curling around Elias's boots. His breath came louder, his own footsteps crunching against the forest floor, blending with the sound of hooves and the sigh of wind. It felt like stepping into another world, one where time bent and memories clung to the roots of trees. At last, midnight slowed. They entered the same small clearing as before, ringed by tall cedars that stood close as prison bars. The light was dimmer here, green and gray and fractured. Midnight lowered his head and gave a low whinny, soft, but insistent. Then, without hesitation, he struck the ground. Once, twice. Elias watched dirt scatter in small bursts. Midnight dug again, more forcefully this time. His hoof tore through soil and tangled roots until a sharper sound rose, a flat metallic clunk that echoed oddly in the hush of the woods. Elias's breath caught. He dropped to his knees beside the disturbed earth, pushing aside the loose soil with calloused fingers. His hand touched something different, hard, smoother than stone, cooler than the surrounding ground. He jerked back as though burned. No, it can't be, he whispered. His heart hammered against his ribs, his pulse ringing in his ears. He had heard stories, of course. Every man who lived near Dry Creek had. Tales of lost travelers, miners who'd buried fortunes in the hills, bandits who'd hidden spoils they never returned to claim. But tales were just that, tales. And yet here was the sound of metal beneath his horse's hoof. His breath unsteady, Elias dug again, this time with more urgency. He pulled a small knife from his belt and used the blade to pry away roots that clung to the object. Damp soil caked his hands, worms writhed in the sudden light, the stench of rot filled his nose. His fingernails tore as he scraped against stubborn earth, but still he worked, driven by something stronger than reason. The soil loosened gradually, revealing a corner of something solid. Not stone, no, this was darker, smoother. It curved slightly, the edge reinforced by a strip of rusted iron. Elias's pulse quickened. This was no natural formation. Midnight, he whispered hoarsely, glancing at the horse. Midnight stood near his body, tense eyes fixed on the ground, as though guarding it. His breath came in short bursts, hot mist in the morning air. Elias swallowed hard and kept digging. His hands stung, mud filled the lines of his palms, insects scattered with every pull of earth. Time became strange, measured not in minutes, but in handfuls of dirt cast aside. After what felt like an eternity, the object revealed itself fully. A chest. It lay half-buried, large enough to hold a man's hope or doom. Its corners bound with blackened iron, its wood dark with age, but astonishingly intact. Thick roots coiled around it, like protective serpents, their fibers clinging as if unwilling to let it go. The soil had preserved it, keeping it safe from decay. For God knew how long. Elias sat back on his heels, panting, sweat-cutting lines through the dirt smeared across his face. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths as his eyes locked on the chest. For a moment he could do nothing but stare. The air around him seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of secrets that had lain hidden for decades. A shiver crawled down his spine. He reached out tentatively, pressing his palm against the lid. Cold. The wood was shockingly cold, as though it carried the chill of deep earth still clinging to it. The touch sent a ripple through him, an unshakable sense that he was standing on the edge of something vast and irrevocable. "Who put you here?" he murmured, his voice rough. "And what are you hiding?" His mind spun with questions tumbling over one another. Who had buried it? When was it treasure or something darker? How many years had it lain beneath the cedars, waiting for a horse's hoof to uncover its secret? Elias drew his hand back, slowly staring at the chest as though it might spring open on its own. 1,000 thoughts clashed in his mind, fear, awe, hope, dread. But one thing was certain, whatever lay inside his life would never be the same again. Then came a sound that didn't belong. At first, Elias thought it was the echo of his own pulse, hammering in his ears. But no, this was steadier, heavier. A dull rhythm rolling through the trees, growing clearer with each beat. Hooves. Midnight stiffened instantly. His ears snapped upright, nostrils flaring as he gave a sharp snort. The horse's body went taut, muscles quivering with unease. Elias felt a cold ripple chase down his spine. Whoever it was, they were close, and they were coming fast. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake his chest. Sweat prickled along his neck despite the cool air. He glanced down at the chest, still half exposed, damning in its evidence, and cursed under his breath. Quickly, he shoved dirt back over the lid with his boots and hands clawing at the soil in a frantic attempt to hide it. The ground looked disturbed, but at least the gleam of metal was gone. Elias stepped in front of the spot, squaring his shoulders, though his insides quaked. The sound of hooves grew louder, filling the clearing, breaking the ancient hush of the hollow. Out of the shadows between the cedars emerged a rider. The man sat tall on a bay horse, his figure cutting clean lines against the gloom. He was in his middle years, broad-shouldered and confident, with a freshly oiled leather coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded sharp eyes. Sunlight caught on the polished buckle at his belt and the shine of boots that had seen care, not hardship. Silas Boone. Elias's stomach sank as though a stone had dropped into it. Of course it was Boone. The man reined in his horse with a smooth pull, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Morning Carter Boone drawled his voice easy casual, as though they had met by chance on a country road. Didn't expect to see you this far out. Elias forced his face into something like calm, though his pulse still raced. Morning, he said, trying to keep his tone even. His hands hung loose at his sides, but every muscle in his body was coiled. Boone's gaze swept lazily across the clearing, though there was nothing lazy about the calculation in his eyes. They flicked over the scuffed soil at Elias's feet, the churn of dirt still damp with sweat and effort. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly, the corners of his mouth twitching with something Elias didn't like. Boone let the silence stretch and then tipped his head with mock admiration. Looks like your horse has got a good nose for treasure. Find anything interesting, Carter? The words landed like a trap sprung. Elias swallowed the dryness in his throat, lifted a hand to wipe the sweat from his brow, and forced a small shrug. Just following my horse's lead. Boone chuckled low and dismissive. A fine horse indeed. Shame you don't have much else left on this land. His eyes gleamed as if he were savoring the sting of his own words. Elias said nothing. He kept his expression neutral, neither confirming nor denying. Boone seemed to enjoy that too, for he swung down from his horse with a grace that spoke of long years in the saddle. His boots crunched softly as he began to walk in slow circles, studying the clearing like a man inspecting property he already owned. The bay horse shifted behind him, reins loose, while Boone bent slightly, tapping the toe of his boot against the loosened soil. The sound rang just enough to betray the hollowness beneath. Boone straightened, and his smile widened, but the emptiness in it chilled Elias more than any frown could have. Trying to break the line of Boone's gaze, Elias cleared his throat. How's your season been? Cattle moving well? Boone raised an eyebrow, amused. Season's what you make of it. Elias pressed on, his voice edged. Funny thing about land, too. Boundaries can get tricky in old surveys. Still, this here's Carter ground. Been that way for generations. Boone paused and spread his hands in feigned innocence. Boundaries are funny things, sure enough. Lines on paper drawn by men with shaky hands and rusty tools. A man could mistake where one piece ends and another begins. The words fell with the weight of a warning. Elias's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. Midnight pawed the ground softly, sensing his master's tension, ears pinned flat. Boone's voice dropped lower, smoother, every syllable sharpened. Folks been wandering these woods lately. Some say they're looking for things that don't belong to them. The implication was clear. Elias felt it like a knife sliding just beneath the ribs. Before he could answer, Midnight let out a low guttural growl of a sound the kind Elias had never heard from him before. The horse's hoof struck the ground hard, sending up a puff of dust. Boone turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing at the animal. "Good instincts," Boone murmured, his lips curling faintly. "Hope he knows who really belongs here." The air between them thickened. Elias could almost taste the iron of it, like blood waiting in the mouth. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the trees leaning closer, the ravens gone silent. All it would take was a spark, a single wrong move, and the hollow would explode with violence. But Boone was nothing if not patient. After a long, taut moment, he tilted his hat back, the smile returning to his face like a mask slipped into place. "Well," he said lightly, "just thought I'd say hello. Neighborly thing to do." He walked back to his horse movements, unhurried, deliberate, as though he owned not just the clearing, but the very air Elias breathed. Mounting smoothly, he gathered the reins and turned the bay toward the trees. Before disappearing into shadow, Boone cast one last look over his shoulder. His eyes met Elias's, sharp and cold as steel, cutting deeper than any blade. No more words were needed. The promise was clear. Then he was gone, hooves fading into the distance, leaving the clearing empty once more. Elias stood motionless, his chest tight, his heart still drumming in his ears. Midnight stayed close, flank pressed against him, the horse's body still trembling with the echo of threat. Elias reached for his mane, steadying himself as much as the animal. "He knows," Elias whispered hoarsely. "Damn it, he knows." The weight of the truth settled heavy on his shoulders. Boone had seen enough to be certain, and he would not come back alone next time. Elias's pulse quickened with dread, but also with resolve. The chest remained hidden for now, but so did the danger circling just out of sight. By morning, he told himself he would be gone from Cedar Hollow. The chest would have to wait. Better to face it with a plan and with daylight. In the half-light of dawn, Elias set about preparing. He gathered what tools he had left: a rusted shovel with a splintering handle, a short-handled pickaxe, an oil lantern with just enough kerosene to last the night, if needed, a coil of rope, and the thickest pair of gloves he owned, cracked leather, but better than bare hands. He wrapped everything in burlap, tying it tight, then dragged the bundle out behind the woodpile and buried it beneath a stack of chopped logs. Better safe there than sitting in plain view. Neighbors in Dry Creek had eyes, and Boone had ears everywhere. Midnight stood tethered near the fence line, stamping restlessly as if sensing what was coming. Elias stroked his mane, steadying himself as much as the animal. "Easy, boy. We've got work to do." He packed a small sack with jerky and bread, strapped it to the saddle horn, and tightened the cinch. His stomach churned with unease. 100 times he thought of staying, of letting it all go and sparing himself the risk. But then the notice burned in his memory again, and he knew he had no choice. His heart beat heavy with dread, but his hands moved with resolve. By the time they slipped into the edge of Cedar Hollow, the sun was little more than a smear of gold behind the mist. Elias didn't take the main trail this time. He knew better. Boone had seen him here before, and if the man was curious once, he would be watching now. So Elias cut across the broken land, ducking through thorny thickets, weaving around moss-slick rocks, and moving slow where the ground dipped low. The air in the hollow clung damp and cold. A thick fog still hugged the roots of the cedars, and the light that managed to pierce through the canopy came in narrow, ghostly shafts. Birds stirred faintly, their calls muffled, as though even they respected the silence of the place. Midnight stepped carefully, ears swiveling at every sound. Twice he stopped, dead nostrils flaring, as though scenting something Elias couldn't see. Elias paused with him crouching low, listening so hard his ears rang. The forest was quiet, save for the faint drip of water from leaves and the creak of branches in the breeze. He kept moving through slower now, every sense stretched taut, waiting for the rhythm of hooves that might betray Boone's presence. Nothing came. At last, the clearing opened before them, the same circle of trees he knew too well. Elias froze as his stomach dropped. The earth was no longer as he had left it. The soil around the chest's hiding place was torn clawed into by tools stronger than hooves or hands. The cuts were fresh edges sharp in the damp ground. A spade had been here, several by the look of it. He knelt low, fingers brushing the churned earth. Boot prints pressed deep into the mud, heavier than his own, broad-soled, angled, as though men had shifted their weight while digging. There were more than one set, too. Elias counted 3 at least. His mouth went dry. Boone. The bastard had come back, just as Elias had feared, sending his men to test the ground. But the job hadn't been finished. Elias's eyes narrowed as he traced the outline of the chest, barely visible through the thin cover of soil. They had uncovered one corner, perhaps enough to confirm what lay below, then covered it again clumsily, as though they hadn't dared to finish the work. Why stop Elias, thought his breath quick. Maybe Boone wanted certainty without exposure. Maybe he wanted Carter himself to sweat, to know that he knew. Or maybe he had been interrupted. Either way, the message was clear. Elias was not alone in this race. A chill went through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was no time to hesitate. Elias unwrapped the bundle of tools, lit the lantern, and set it on a rock where the light could fall across the pit. Then he thrust the shovel into the earth and began to dig. The soil gave grudgingly heavy with last night's moisture. Every strike sent a dull thud through the clearing, each one echoing far too loudly in the quiet. His breath came harsh sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. Clumps of dirt flew back, landing with wet slaps. His muscles burned quickly, the old injuries in his shoulders, screaming against the effort, but he didn't stop. Fear lent him strength. He imagined Boone stepping out from behind a tree, imagined his smile when he caught Elias standing over the uncovered chest. That thought drove him harder, faster. Midnight shifted near the tree line, head high, ears pricked. The horse snorted sharply at intervals, as though warning of things Elias couldn't yet hear. Elias risked a glance now and then, but the trees gave nothing away. Only the hollow thump of metal against rock, only the rasp of his own breath. The ground slowly gave way. The shovel struck roots thick and knotted, and Elias cursed under his breath. He hacked at them with the pickaxe, splitting fibers, prying them out of the soil one by one. Each strike sent vibrations through his arms, his palms numbing. His gloves tore his skin blistered, but still he swung, sweat soaking through his shirt. It became a brutal rhythm: strike, scoop, lift, breathe. Strike, scoop, lift, breathe. The rope was next. Elias looped it around the exposed corner of the chest, knotting it tight. He braced his boots against the earth and heaved. The chest shifted, rising an inch before settling back with a groan of strained wood and rusted iron. "Come on, Elias," grunted, sweat dripping into his eyes. "You're not staying down here another 100 years." He tugged again, harder this time. The chest slid slowly, roots tearing free with sharp snaps. A cloud of damp earth rose around him, choking his lungs. He spat grit and pulled once more, his arms trembling with the effort. The lantern light flickered across the metal bands as more of the chest came into view. Each glint spurred him forward, drove him past the screaming in his muscles, past the fire in his chest. He dug, chopped, and dragged until the box was clear of the worst of the soil. Midnight gave a sudden whinny, loud and sharp, jerking Elias out of his focus. The horse pawed at the ground, nostrils flared, staring into the trees as though something moved within. Elias, froze shovel, clutched tight, ears straining. For a moment he thought he heard it in the faint creak of leather, the whisper of hooves. But then it was gone, swallowed by the heavy quiet of the hollow. "Easy, boy," Elias whispered. But his pulse thundered in his ears. He bent again to his work. The chest was nearly free now, its full shape emerging from the earth like a corpse from a grave. Its wooden sides were dark, but intact, and the iron fittings blackened with age, but strong. Elias dropped to his knees, both hands gripping the rope. He pulled with every ounce of strength left in him, his body shaking, the breath tearing from his lungs. The chest lurched upward, rolling onto the edge of the pit with a heavy crash. The chest lay before him. Like a body exhumed its sides, slick with damp earth, its corners wrapped in roots that had clung to it for decades. Elias sat in the mud, gasping, his arms still trembling from the effort of dragging it free. The lantern light quivered against the iron fittings, making them gleam dully through their coating of rust. His hand shook as he reached for the clasp. The metal was cold beneath his fingertips, stiff with age. He pressed his thumb against the latch, hesitated, then forced it upward with a sharp motion. It creaked stiff at first, then gave way with a reluctant snap. Elias swallowed hard. The weight of generations seemed to settle onto his shoulders. His fingers curled beneath the lip of the lid. With a groan of wood swollen by time, he lifted. A breath escaped him in a broken rush. Golden light spilled upward, catching in the haze of lantern smoke. Coins glimmered in chaotic stacks, their edges slick with tarnish, yet still gleaming as if defiant against time. Bars of gold lay cradled between them, heavy and pure, each stamped with markings long forgotten. Among the heap, stones red-green, clear as frozen fire, caught the light and threw it back in fractured brilliance. The smell hit him next, rust and aged wood, mingling with damp soil and the sharp tang of kerosene. There was the scent of secrets kept too long underground, of iron and wealth and decay. Elias fell to his knees, breathless, staring into the chest as though it were an altar. His dirty hands hovered just above the surface, afraid to disturb it, afraid it might vanish if he touched it. He forced himself to focus, to see what lay before him with the eye of a man, not a dreamer. The first layer was coins. Elias lifted one, holding it up to the lantern. A Mexican peso, silver dulled, but the eagle and snake still clear. He picked up another, an American silver dollar, its date, worn edges rough from circulation. Beneath it lay European currency, French francs, Spanish reals, even a coin stamped with the likeness of a crowned king he didn't recognize. The collection was a history lesson in metal proof that these riches had passed through many hands before finding their grave in Cedar Hollow. Then his gaze shifted to the bars. They were thick and crude, stamped with symbols of mines, crossed hammers, a set of initials carved deep. Elias grunted as he lifted one. It weighed heavy in his palm, nearly dragging his arm down. The weight was staggering, not just physical, but symbolic. "It's the future," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "The damn future sitting right here." His mind raced. A single bar could wipe out his debts. 2 could buy back the land Boone had stolen from others. 3 could change not only his life, but the lives of generations to come. And there were more than a dozen bars glimmering back at him. Elias pressed one to his chest, feeling the chills seep into his skin. For the first time in months, hope was not some far-off fantasy. It was heavy and real, resting in the curve of his hand. But the coins and gold weren't the only marvels. Nestled between the stacks, wrapped in scraps of oiled cloth, were gemstones. Elias pulled one free and held it up. A ruby the size of his thumb blazed in the lantern glow, its surface throwing red fire across the clearing. Next came a shard of emerald deep green as pine needles, and then a rough diamond, its edges cloudy, but catching the light like frozen lightning. Elias blinked against their brilliance. He had never seen such things outside of store windows in distant towns, and even then never of this size. Here they were scattered in handfuls as though some careless god had spilled pieces of the night sky into the chest. Under the lantern's glow, they burned like stars. He couldn't help but laugh, though it came out broken and breathless. It's all here," he whispered. "Gold, silver, jewels. Enough to buy the world." The realization struck like a hammer. This was not just wealth. This was power. The sheer value of what lay before him staggered his thoughts. He calculated roughly, fumbling numbers in his head. The gold alone, hundreds of pounds, would fetch hundreds of thousands, perhaps more. The silver and coins added to it. The gems doubled it again. It wasn't just a fortune. It was millions by any reckoning. Millions. Elias rocked back on his heels, dizzy. He thought of the cabin, its roof sagging, the bills stacked on the table, the notice that had felt like his death sentence. All of it could vanish in an instant, buried beneath this avalanche of wealth. He was no longer the poor rancher clinging to a dying patch of earth. With this chest, he could be anything. But with that thought came fear, sharp and bitter. Such riches didn't lie quiet for long. They drew eyes, sharpened knives, spilled blood. Boone already suspected. If he saw this, if he so much as sniffed it, he would come with an army. Elias clenched his fists, sweat breaking cold across his brow. Fortune this large wasn't a blessing, it was bait. He dug deeper, pushing aside coins and cloth, until his fingers struck something firm yet supple. Pulling it free, he found a leather-bound book, edges stained dark with time. The cover cracked under his touch, its stitching frayed, but it held together. He set it carefully on his knee and angled the lantern light across it. The front was marked in faded ink, Thomas Granger Minor, 1852. Elias's throat went dry. He flipped the cover open, turning pages slowly, reverently. Inside, the writing sprawled in a strong hand, dark at first, then fainter as the years had worn the ink thin. Entries spoke of the mine days of backbreaking labor notes on yields 40 pounds pulled in one day. Tally marks and rough sketches filled the margins. Interspersed were darker thoughts, mentions of thieves shadowing their camp of companions who betrayed trust, of long nights, guarding what they had found with rifle in hand. The words painted a portrait of a man hardened by the land, by hunger and violence. But beneath it all, Elias could hear the weariness, the creeping despair. Granger wrote of burying a portion of his fortune to keep it safe, of never knowing if he would live to reclaim it. Elias's hands shook as he read. It was as though the dead miner were speaking directly across the years, warning him that wealth was never simple, never free of shadow. Near the back, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew jagged, hurried, as though written under duress. Elias leaned closer, his eyes scanning the lines. They close in. Can trust no one. Buried what I must. If I fall, let the worthy man continue my work. His pulse quickened. He turned the final page and found a drawing, a crude map, but clear. It sketched the ridges north of Dry Creek, a winding trail marked with X's, ending at a point labeled the Vein. Elias stared, unable to breathe. This wasn't just a chest of treasure. It was a marker, a promise. What Granger had buried here was only a portion, a safeguard. The true fortune, the heart of the mine, still lay untouched somewhere in the mountains. The weight of it crashed over him. Not just wealth for survival, not just enough to pay debts or patch roofs. This was legacy. This was empire. He slumped back against the earth, the journal clutched in his hands. Midnight shifted close, the horse's breath hot against his shoulder. Elias laughed softly, though it was shaky, broken. "Not just treasure, boy," he whispered. "A mine. A damn gold mine waiting for us." Midnight gave a low whinny as if answering. Elias lifted the journal, staring at the final words again. "If I fall, let the worthy man continue my work." He didn't know if he was worthy. He didn't know if anyone was. But he knew one thing with certainty: his life had just split in two. The man he had been before this chest and the man he would become after. The journal still lay warm against Elias's chest, tucked inside his coat, where his heart hammered against it like a frantic drum. He had barely slid it there when Midnight's ears shot upright. The horse's entire frame stiffened, nostrils, flaring muscles twitching in warning. Elias froze. The forest, once filled with the crackle of insects and the occasional bird call, seemed to collapse into silence. Then came the sound, distant, at first faint as a heartbeat, but growing steadily louder. The heavy rhythm of hooves. Not one horse this time, but several, their cadence carrying through the cedars like the roll of thunder. A chill slid down Elias's spine. His breath caught in his throat, and he sank back into the shadows of the trees. His hand dropped instinctively to the knife at his belt, fingers brushing the worn handle. There was no mistaking it, Boone was coming back. And this time, Elias knew he would not come alone or with polite greetings. Midnight pawed the ground uneasily, a low rumble rising from his throat. Elias whispered sharply, "Quiet, boy." But his own pulse was anything but steady. Boone had returned, and whatever came next would not be neighborly. They emerged from the trees with the arrogance of men who believed the forest belonged to them. Silas Boone led the way, astride a chestnut stallion, its coat shining despite the dust of the trail. Boone himself looked every bit the wealthy rancher. He was his leather coat fresh, his hat wide, and shadowing eyes, sharp as knives. Behind him rode two men Elias didn't recognize, broad-shouldered cowhands, with the look of men who had seen too many barroom fights and not enough baths. Their coats were stained with sweat revolvers, hanging heavy at their hips, and their boots dug deep into the flanks of their horses. The trio stopped at the edge of the clearing. Boone swung down from his saddle with an ease born of practice, his boots hitting the soil with a solid thud. He pulled off his gloves slowly, almost theatrically, and offered Elias a smile that was all venom. "I knew I'd find you here," Carter Boone said, voice slick with triumph. The two men dismounted behind him, fanning out wide, one drifting left, the other right, until Elias felt boxed in. Their stance was casual, but calculated, each within reach of his gun, and their eyes cold and watchful. Boone strolled toward the churned earth, the place where the chest had lain moments ago. He tapped the toe of his polished boot against the disturbed soil, his smile never faltering. Then, he lifted his gaze to Elias, locking eyes with him. "No sense pretending anymore?" Boone said, his tone slow and deliberate. "We both know what lies under there." Elias kept his face steady, though his pulse thundered. Boone spread his arms in mock generosity. "Here's how it is, Carter. You get to keep this little scrap of land. You get to keep your shack. In return, I take my share 60%. 60 for me, 40 for you. Fair as the sunrise, ain't it?" He let the offer hang in the air before adding, "I'll make sure the county clerk looks the other way on your debts. Paperwork disappears, auctions vanish. You walk away a free man, even rich. All it costs you is a bit of that shiny fortune." Elias's fists clenched at his sides. He drew a slow breath, forcing steel into his voice. "That's generous of you," he said evenly. "But I'm not interested." Boone's smile tightened. His eyes narrowed, the gleam in them colder now. "Think carefully," Carter Boone murmured, voice dropping to a warning growl. 10 days isn't long. Without me, you'll lose everything. With me, you get to keep your land, your pride, even that nag of a horse." He glanced toward his men, then back at Elias, his smile stretching thin. "Without me." Boone's gaze slid deliberately to the hired guns, both standing loose in easy hands, hovering close to their revolvers. The message was clear. Midnight let out a sharp snort, pawing at the ground, his ears pinned flat against his skull. The sound echoed through the trees like thunder before a storm. Elias reached out and steadied the reins, his knuckles white. Boone chuckled softly, feigning patience. "I don't want blood spilled, Carter. I want business. But if you make me choose..." He shrugged, the gesture careless, dangerous. Elias felt the weight of the Granger Journal pressing against his chest. Boone wasn't offering partnership. He was circling like a wolf, waiting for the right moment to tear. Elias's voice came low, firm, carrying across the tense air. "This land's mine. The treasure, too. You won't take either." Boone tilted his head back and laughed, the sound harsh and humorless. "Stubborn as your father," he said. "And look where it got him." The word struck like a blow. Heat rushed to Elias's face, anger surging hot and sharp. His father's memory was a wound Boone had no right to touch. For a moment, Elias's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt, but he forced it, still gripping Midnight's reins instead. His eyes locked on Boone's, burning with defiance. Boone saw it and smirked, shaking his head slowly. "Like father, like son," he muttered, always clinging to dirt and pride. The wind rose, suddenly rushing through the cedars. Branches creaked overhead, and dry leaves rattled across the ground. The clearing felt alive with tension, the air so thick it could be cut with a blade. The two hired men shifted subtly, each sliding a step closer, hands resting on the butts of their guns. The faint scrape of leather filled the space between heartbeats. Boone took another step forward, his boots crunching against the soil. "Last chance, Carter," he said softly, though the venom in his tone was unmistakable. 60-40 or nothing at all. Elias didn't move. His grip on Midnight's reins tightened, but his body was steady, his face calm in the lantern's glow. When he finally spoke, his words were ice. "Then nothing it is." Boone's smile vanished, replaced by something colder, sharper. For a moment, no one breathed. The forest itself seemed to listen, waiting for the spark that would ignite the fire. Then, without warning, Midnight screamed. The sound ripped through the clearing like thunder, a shrill, ear-splitting cry that froze even Boone where he stood. Elias turned in shock, just as his horse reared, black mane, flying hooves lashing the air. In a blur of muscle and fury, Midnight hurled himself forward, not at Boone, but at the other horses. The bay and the roan, startled beyond reason, shrieked and lunged sideways. Midnight struck the ground with bone-shaking force, his hooves pounding the soil in a rhythm that echoed like war drums. His breath came out in heavy blasts, nostrils flaring white against his midnight coat. His eyes burned with wild defiance, and for the first time, Elias saw not just an animal, but something elemental, raw as the storm itself. The hired men shouted, tugging desperately at their reins, but Midnight was already upon them. He lunged with terrifying precision, snapping his teeth at the bay's flank and driving his shoulder against the roan's chest. The other horses panicked instantly, rearing, thrashing, tearing the ground to ribbons beneath them. Elias stood rooted, astonished. In all their years together, he had never seen Midnight like this, feral, furious, a warhorse risen from the past. Chaos exploded. The first of Boone's men had no chance. His mount spun wild, and the man was thrown clear arms, flailing. He hit the ground with a sickening thud and rolled groaning, clutching his ribs. Dust shot up around him, choking the air. The second gunman tried to hold on, yanking at the reins, cursing, but his roan bolted. The horse careened through the trees, crashing branches, and the man's shouts fading quickly into the depths of Cedar Hollow. Boone swore and fought to control his own stallion, jerking hard on the reins. The animal reared, nearly unseating him, eyes rolling in terror at midnight's rampage. Boone's face darkened, his composure shattered, and for the first time, his confident smirk slipped. The clearing, once tight with silence, now erupted with sound hooves, pounding men, shouting horses, screaming dust hanging thick in the air. Elias's instincts kicked in. Boone was distracted, his men scattered. There would never be another chance. He dropped to his knees by the chest, yanked the rope he had prepared earlier, and looped it tight around the iron fittings. His muscles screamed with the effort, but adrenaline coursed through him, lending strength he didn't know he had. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the grime on his cheeks. "Come on," he muttered between clenched teeth. "Come on, damn you. We can't let Boone win." The chest scraped and groaned as he heaved, sliding inch by inch across the soil. His back burned, his arms trembled, but he pulled with a desperation born of survival. Behind him, Midnight pivoted sharply, planting himself squarely between Boone and Elias. The stallion's body was a wall of black muscle, his head lowered, ears pinned, daring Boone to try. Boone yanked his horse into submission, but the animal trembled beneath him, refusing to step forward against the raging beast in its path. Elias staggered as he dragged the chest toward the tree line. The rope cut into his palms, his boots dug deep grooves into the earth, and his breath came ragged. Still, he did not stop. Boone shouted behind him, his voice a mixture of fury and disbelief, but Elias kept moving step by brutal step. At the edge of the clearing, he wrestled the chest onto a small handcart hidden beneath brush, an old contraption he had dragged from his shed for this very purpose. It groaned under the weight of the wooden wheels, creaking ominously, but it held. Elias lashed it fast, every knot a prayer, then grabbed the handle and heaved. Midnight wheeled back, retreating toward him in perfect timing, then spun once more to block Boone's view. The horse's hooves tore divots in the soil, his body radiating menace. Elias could hardly believe the animal he had raised with gentle hands was now fighting like a soldier bred for war. The path toward the creek was rough, winding through gnarled roots and uneven ground. Elias strained against the cart, the chest rattling inside each bump, threatening to tip it. Branches clawed at his arms, sweat poured down his spine, but he forced himself forward. He remembered his grandfather's words whispered long ago during one of their hunts. "If ever trouble finds you, boy, there's a cave by the water. Hidden well. Use it only when you've got no other choice." This was that moment. Behind him, Boone shouted curses, the sound cutting through the forest. Elias risked a glance back. Boone still fought his stallion, trying to wrench the animal under control, but the beast was panicked beyond reason, refusing to charge Midnight. Dust rose in clouds, swallowing the scene. It bought Elias precious time. He stumbled forward, nearly tripping over a thick root, then righted himself and kept going. His lungs burned, his muscles ached, but the chest rattling behind him urged him on. Boone's rage echoed after him. But distance dulled it, smothered by the hiss of the forest and the rising sound of rushing water. The cave revealed itself like a miracle. Nestled behind a curtain of vines, its entrance was little more than a dark gash in the stone wall beside the creek. Elias dropped to his knees, yanking the vines aside, dragging the cart forward with a final cry of effort. The chest screeched across the stone floor as he shoved it inside. He rolled rocks and branches across the entrance, covering the gap, until it looked once more like part of the hillside. His chest heaved, his hands bled from rope burns, his entire body shook with exhaustion. Outside, the creek whispered over stones, its steady song masking the chaos that had nearly consumed him. Midnight stood guard just beyond the vines, his sides heaving, his coat lathered with sweat. His eyes, though, were alive, bright with fire. He pawed the ground once, twice, then stood tall, facing the forest, as though daring Boone to follow. At last, Elias slumped against the cool stone, sliding down, until he sat in the dirt. His arms dangled limp at his sides, his breath ragged. The pounding of his heart was still too loud in his ears, too fast. But slowly it began to settle. He looked at Midnight through the curtain of vines. The horse stood like a sentinel, breathing hard, but unbroken. Elias whispered hoarsely, "You just saved my life, boy. Saved my future, too." He rubbed his face with trembling hands, forcing air into his lungs. Relief mixed with dread in his chest. The treasure was hidden safe for now. If he wanted to keep the chest, the land, even his own life, he needed something stronger than secrecy. He needed the law. The thought frightened him as much as it steadied him. He had spent his life on the margins, always one step from ruin, rarely trusting anyone in town, except the horse that never left his side. But now, with Boone closing in, there was no other way. At dawn, Elias packed carefully. He chose 3 small gold bars, no larger than bricks of soap, heavy enough to prove his claim, but light enough to carry. Alongside them, he slid the Granger journal into a cloth sack, wrapping it with care, as though it were a holy relic. He tied the bag tight and tucked it into his saddlebag. When he stepped out of the cabin, the air was sharp with morning chill. Midnight stood ready, the black stallion pawing the earth as if he too sensed the urgency. Elias tightened the cinch, checked the cinch knot twice, and mounted. He spared a last glance at the ranch, his broken fences, his leaning barn, his father's fields gone to weeds. He would not let Boone steal it. Not now. "Come on, boy," he whispered. To Dry Creek. The trails stretched long and dry before them. The sun rose quickly, burning away the cool of morning, and soon heat shimmered across the plains. Dust rose from Midnight's hooves in little clouds clinging to Elias's clothes, his skin, his throat. The land rolled by in weary waves, patches of brittle grass, stretches of cracked earth, scattered mesquite trees, casting thin slivers of shade. Elias kept his eyes sharp, scanning every ridge and dip, wary of riders that might follow. But the road was empty. Only the relentless sun kept him company. For all the unease, something stirred inside him that he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real hope, not the thin thread he'd clung to before. The gold clinked faintly in his saddlebag with every step, and the sound was like a bell tolling for a new life. As they passed a cluster of homesteads, Elias caught the stares. Women hanging laundry paused, their eyes following him. A pair of men by a well tipped their hats in surprise. Children pointed, whispering. Elias Carter, the poor rancher who had nearly vanished into ruin, was riding into town again. He ignored the looks, though. Inside he felt the weight of everyone. The gold rattled again in his bag, heavy as destiny. Dry Creek's main street lay hot and dusty under the noonday sun. Wagons creaked past, merchants called their wares, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang faintly from down the road. Elias rode straight for the bank, its brick facade standing proud against the clapboard buildings around it. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling of ink and polish. A young clerk looked up, blinking at Elias's dust-stained figure. "Can I help you, sir?" Elias strode to the counter, reached into his bag, and set one of the gold bars down with a heavy clunk. The metal gleamed, throwing back the light. The clerk's mouth dropped open. "I'm here." Elias said evenly, to settle every debt and every tax tied to the Carter Ranch. Wipe it clean. The manager himself appeared within moments, a rotund man with spectacles who nearly tripped over his own feet when he saw the gold. He lifted the bar with trembling hands, his eyes wide. Good Lord, this is genuine. There's more where that came from. Elias said, his voice cold as steel. Mark my words down proper. The ranch stays mine. Papers were fetched, seals pressed, stamps slammed onto ledgers. In less than an hour, the debts that had hung like a noose around Elias's neck for years were gone, dissolved in the shine of gold. When he stepped back onto the street, whispers chased him. Carter paid in gold. Carter's struck it rich. The rumor spread like wildfire, buzzing from saloon to mercantile to livery stable. By sundown, the whole town would know. Elias clenched his jaw. That was both blessing and danger. His next stop was the sheriff's office. The wooden sign creaked above the door, and inside the place smelled of old leather and tobacco. Behind a desk sat Sheriff Daniels, a man past 50 with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much but still burned with purpose. He looked up as Elias entered, his brow furrowing. "Carter," he said. "Been a while." Elias wasted no time. He pulled the Granger journal from his bag and set it gently on the desk. "This belonged to Thomas Granger. I found it with something buried on my land." Daniels raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He opened the cover, his rough fingers surprisingly careful, as he flipped through the pages. His eyes lingered over the entries, accounts of gold pulled from the earth, of threats from thieves, of a chest buried for safekeeping. Elias spoke while he read, telling him of Midnight's digging the chest, the gold, and Boone's threats. When he finished, the office was silent. Daniels closed the journal slowly and leaned back in his chair. His expression was grave but steady. "This isn't just a stash," he said at last. "This is history, evidence. And by the law of this county, a man who finds such property, provided he's got proof, has the right to claim it." Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The words were like cool water poured over fire. For the first time, the weight on his shoulders lightened. Sheriff Daniels tapped the journal with one finger. "This here's your proof. Boone may bluster and bully, but he can't take this not legally, at least not on paper." Elias knotted his throat tight. "So the land, the treasure, it's mine." Daniels gave a short nod. "Yours, by right, by law." The relief hit Elias like a wave, nearly buckling his knees. Months of fear and despair drained away in an instant, leaving him dizzy. For the first time since the notice arrived, he felt like he could breathe. But Daniels wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Paper alone won't stop Boone. You know that as well as I do. Men like him don't give up because a sheriff waves a law book." Elias swallowed. "I know." Daniels stood, adjusting his gun belt. "Which is why you won't be riding back alone. I'll send 2 of my deputies with you. If Boone shows his face again, I'll be there soon after. And if he dares try something underhanded, I'll put irons on him myself." He extended his hand. Elias gripped it tightly, the rough strength grounding him. For the first time in days, Elias didn't feel alone. Boone might have money men and influence, but Elias had something stronger now, the law on his side, and honest men willing to stand with him. The sun was already sinking toward the ridges when Elias Carter rode back to his ranch. Midnight's hooves struck the hardpan with steady rhythm, his black hide gleaming with sweat, his ears swiveling at every sound. Beside Elias rode Sheriff Daniels, shoulders squared in his worn duster, his badge glinting like a shard of silver fire. 2 deputies followed close behind, Harrison young but quick-eyed and Tate older thick through the shoulders, his hand never far from his revolver. They rode in silence, the dust from their horses curling in the long light of evening. Elias could feel the weight of the treasure hidden in the creekside cave like a brand against his conscience. Boone had been thwarted, but the man would not rest. Tonight, Elias knew the ranch would not see peace. By the time they reached the cabin, shadows stretched long across the fields. The place looked as it always had. Leaning fence posts, roof patched with tin door, hanging on rusted hinges. But now, it had become a fortress. Sheriff Daniels walked the perimeter, once his gaze sharp, then gave quick orders. "We'll hold here. Carter, you watch the back with your horse. Keep Midnight tied loose so he can move if things turn rough. Tate, take the left window. Harrison the right. I'll sit inside in plain sight. Let Boone see me when he comes calling." No one argued. Elias secured Midnight near the porch, but left the reins slack, the stallion's body tense and ready. The cabin windows were braced with planks, rifles resting in the gap's shadows inside, waiting like coiled snakes. Then came the silence, the heavy silence of men waiting for trouble. The trouble came the next evening. The sky turned red as blood as the sun fell across Dry Creek. The air shimmered with heat, and then faint at first, a sound rose on the horizon, the thunder of hooves. Dust billowed in the distance, growing thicker closer until it swallowed the road. Silas Boone rode at the head, his coat flapping, his hat tilted low. 4 armed men flanked him, their horses snorting, their faces hard as stone. They came with the swagger of men who believed fear itself was their weapon, and the kind of swagger Elias had known all his life from Boone. The rumble of their approach shook the cabin walls. Elias stood near the doorway, fists clenched, while Harrison and Tate leveled their rifles. Midnight pawed the earth ears, flat, his muscles quivering, as though he could smell Boone's malice in the wind. Boone reined up 20 yards from the cabin. The horses stamped and blew clouds of dust around them, the smell of sweat and leather filling the air. Carter Boone's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with false bravado. Time to settle this like men. He wanted the whole countryside to hear, Elias realized. Wanted to paint him as a coward if he stayed inside, to bait him into stepping out and dying under the open sky. Elias shifted, ready to speak, but Sheriff Daniels' hands shot out, stopping him. "Wait," the sheriff muttered. His eyes were cold, steady. "This is my stage now." Elias swallowed hard and nodded. His fingers itched for the rifle, but he stayed still. The cabin door creaked. Sheriff Daniels stepped out broad and unhurried, his badge flashing in the crimson light. He walked to the porch edge, lifted his chin, and called out in a voice that carried like a hammer strike. "Silas Boone, you're under arrest for attempted theft, for extortion, and for threats made against a law-abiding citizen of Dry Creek." Or, the words dropped heavy into the air. Boone's men shifted in their saddles, startled, their eyes darting to one another. Boone himself froze for half a second, his grin faltering. Then he spat into the dust. "You can't be serious," he sneered. "This is business, Sheriff. A private matter between men." Daniels didn't flinch. Business doesn't carry 6 shooters into another man's yard. Business doesn't chase him with hired guns. You cross that line. And from this moment, any move you make is against the law. Inside the cabin, Elias let out a slow breath, but his stomach was still tight. Boone was a snake. Cornering him only made him strike harder. Boone laughed, a harsh sound. "You think you can cage me with words, Daniels? I've got more pull in this county than you've got bullets. You'd best step aside." "Not today," Daniels said flatly. The silence thickened. One of Boone's men muttered something under his breath, his hand sliding closer to his revolver. Midnight caught the motion before Elias did. The stallion stamped hard, snorting his breath, hissing like steam. Elias could feel it building, the fragile thread snapping. The first shot came from Boone's side. One of his men snapped, yanking his pistol free and firing toward the cabin in a wild rush. The blast tore the silence apart. But Deputy Harrison was faster. His rifle barked once the shot echoing like a thunderclap. Boone's gunman screamed, spinning from his saddle and crashing to the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His horse bolted, kicking dust and panic into the line. The other men froze their bravado, draining into uncertainty. Boone wheeled on them, shouting curses, but Sheriff Daniels was already moving. He drew his revolver in a single fluid motion and leveled it at Boone's chest. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff roared. Now Tate swung his rifle toward the others, steady as stone. Elias stepped into the doorway, his father's old hunting gun braced in his hands and the barrels gleaming. The balance of power had shifted in a heartbeat. Boone's face twisted. He looked left-right, one man writhing in the dirt, three more wavering their horses, sidestepping nervously. Daniels advanced a step, his revolver unwavering authority radiating like a brand. The sheriff's deputies backed him with cold steel, their eyes locked on the hired guns. Midnight hissed and stamped again, and the ground trembling under his hooves. One of Boone's men swore and dropped his revolver into the dust. Another followed, lifting his hands. Daniel's gaze cut to the third, and Tate fired a warning shot into the sky. The blast sent Boone's horse into a frenzy, rearing and lashing. The third man threw down his gun before he could be thrown. The fight had drained from them. Boone's men sat, hunched, defeated. But Boone himself. Boone's jaw clenched, his skin pale under the dust, his pride refusing to bend. Silas Boone Daniels said, his voice low and commanding, "Dismount, now." Boone glared, his eyes burning with hatred. For a heartbeat, Elias thought he might actually draw, might gamble his life in one last blaze. But his horse still danced under him, wild from the warning shot, and Daniel's revolver never wavered. Slowly, stiffly, Boone swung down from the saddle. The sheriff signaled, and Tate stepped forward, rope in hand. Boone's wrists were bound tight, his hat knocked to the dirt. His men were tied just as fast, their faces blank with fear and shame. Boone fought the ropes, his teeth bared. "This ain't over, Carter." He spat, his voice rough with fury. "I've got friends. You'll never be safe. Not in Dry Creek, not anywhere." Elias stepped out beside Daniels, his face calm, his voice steady as stone. "Maybe. But today you answer to the law." Boone froze at the words, his nostrils flaring, his eyes dark with hate. The sheriff shoved him forward toward the waiting horses, and the sun caught Boone's glare one last time. It was a look Elias knew would haunt him, cold, venomous, a vow of vengeance carved into a man's soul. But for now, the law held him. The ranch stood free. And as Boone was marched away, bound and cursing, Elias felt something new take root inside him. 6 months later, the hollow that had once hidden a chest of secrets was no longer silent. The Granger mine roared with life again. Elias Carter stood at the mouth of the shaft, boots planted on solid ground, watching as wagons rattled by their loads piled high with ore. Men shouted to one another over the din of pickaxes striking rock, the clang echoing through the valley like a hymn to labor and fortune. Lanterns glowed along the timbered tunnels, throwing flickers of gold across walls that glittered faintly in the light. Sluice boxes along the creek shimmered as flakes of yellow swirled and settled, each spark a promise of more to come. What had once been rumor was now fact. The Granger vein was real, and it was rich. Elias had hired workers from Dry Creek and beyond, men eager for honest paymen who now sang as they swung their hammers. The wealth was no longer hidden, it flowed measured and protected. Sheriff Daniels made his rounds from time to time, riding out to ensure order was kept, his badge, a reminder that the law still stood watch. Boone's shadow lingered in whispers, but with Daniels near, no one dared test their luck. For Elias, the sight of the mine no longer brought fear, only gratitude. From a man clinging to scraps, he had become a man whose word carried weight, whose name drew nods of respect. He touched the brim of his hat, breathing deep the smell of rock dust and pine, and thought, "This was never meant to be mine. But now it is, and I'll guard it with everything I've got." Back at the ranch, the transformation was even more striking. Where once a sagging cabin had leaned against the wind, there now stood a sturdy home built from fresh pine, its walls square, its roof tiled with red shingles that caught the sunlight like fire. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, not thin and desperate, but rich, with the scent of roasting meat and strong coffee. The field stretched green again, fed by irrigation channels Elias had dug and a well that reached deep, cold water. Fences ran true rails, new and strong. The barns bustled, horses stomping in the stalls, chickens scattering across the yard, cattle lowing from pastures that had once been bare. Neighbors came often, not to pity as they once had, but to lend a hand, to celebrate, to claim a piece of shared pride. Dry Creek's folk had seen the law hold steady against greed, seen one of their own rise from ruin to triumph. Elias's ranch was no longer only his. It had become a symbol that grit and justice could stand against even the likes of Silas Boone. He expanded, buying back land that Boone had swallowed, tripling his spread until Dry Creek Ranch stretched across the valley. It was no empire, not yet, but it was a kingdom compared to the half-dead patch of earth he had once called home. And at the heart of it all was Midnight. The black stallion was no longer just Elias's horse. To the people of Dry Creek, he was legend. Children chased after him when he galloped through the fields, their laughter ringing as they reached for his flying mane. Old women touched his forehead reverently, whispering blessings, calling him the creature who had sniffed out fortune. Men tipped their hats when they saw him, as though acknowledging not an animal, but a comrade in the fight for survival. Elias gave him the best of everything. A wide stall lined with sweet hay buckets, filled with clear water and pastures, where he could run free whenever he pleased. Yet Midnight seemed happiest when standing close by his master, his calm ears twitching toward the sound of Elias's voice. Some nights Elias sat by the stall door, running a hand through that coarse black mane, whispering, "Without you, none of this would have happened. You carried me through every storm. You brought me to the chest. You gave me a future." Midnight would only huff, leaning his great head against Elias's shoulder, as if to say it was nothing more than what a friend should do. There were nights, too, when memory rose sharp and bitter. Elias would sit on the porch of his new cabin, staring out at the fields lit pale by moonlight, and remember what it had cost to get here. He remembered the red lettering on the foreclosure notice, his hands shaking as he held it. He remembered the weight of hunger, the emptiness of his pockets, the shame of watching his father's land waste away. He remembered Silas Boone's sneer, the glint of greed in his eyes, the moment the ropes had cinched around his wrists. But above all, Elias remembered the choice again and again, to keep standing, to trust the horse that had led him to cling to the belief that there was more waiting if he dared. The gold had saved his ranch, yes, but it was not the treasure alone that had delivered him. It was loyalty, courage, stubbornness. It was the bond between a man and his horse, and the refusal to let Boone or fate dictate his end. One evening, as the sun sank low and the valley filled with the glow of fire, Elias saddled Midnight and rode. The field stretched endless before them, green waves rolling under the wind. Children's laughter carried faintly from the ranch yard where neighbors gathered for supper. From the far ridge came the faint clang of hammers from the mine steady, and sure a song of labor and reward. The sky burned crimson, streaked with orange and violet. Midnight's mane whipped in the wind, the stallion's muscles bunching and releasing beneath Elias as they galloped. The sound of hooves drummed a rhythm that matched the pounding of Elias's heart. He drew in a long breath, tasting the dust and the promise of tomorrow. The ache of hunger, the weight of debt, the shadow of boon, and all of it felt like another lifetime now. He was not the same man who had stared at foreclosure notices in despair. He was not the man who had hidden in a cave clutching a chest. He was Elias Carter, rancher, miner, survivor. A man with land, with work, with hope. As the sun dipped low, casting long fire across the plains, Elias reined midnight toward the horizon. The stallion's dark shape cut against the glow mane and tail streaming like banners. Behind them lay hardship and ruin. Ahead lay freedom, prosperity, and the wide open promise of the West. And so man and horse rode together into the blaze of evening, the image of survival and triumph, etched forever against the dying light. For Elias, it was not an ending. It was the first true beginning.